Hi there, this is Stu Fenton and we are back with section 4 of the ChemSex Knowledge series, and this one is titled What Do Gay Men Need to Remember About ChemSex and HIV? First of all, I'm just going to give a brief history of ChemSex and HIV, and it's a little bit from a personal perspective of my own. So back during the AIDS crisis, obviously there was a reaction to the situation where the use of condoms was pushed very much so by the government and healthcare organisations, and this obviously slowed down the amount of infections of HIV. And so there became a culture in the gay community that sort of developed from the mid-90s up until 2000, which looked at barebacking. And barebacking is when gay men started to have unprotected sex again, knowing that the medication was there if in the worst case scenario they were to contract HIV. So during this culture of barebacking, obviously HIV rates started to increase a little bit, and it was in the early 2000s that the chemsex phenomena really started to take off. And at this time, this was before we had the apps on the smartphones, and mostly gay men were hooking up through Gaydar and Manhunt, which were dating apps, but which could only be accessed through computer systems. However, it really was the beginning of chemsex, because gay men were using these dating sites to be able to find other people using drugs, particularly crystal meth and GHB, and to get together for group sex and to get together for sex in general. So this carried on, and then, right through to 2016, this is really where chemsex took off in those years. But around 2016, PrEP came into play as well, and it had been proven that if you were undetectable, then HIV was untransmissible between two people. And so at this point, gay men stopped using condoms to a degree. And what we saw in this time was that HIV rates, specifically if you look at a place like London, started to drop significantly. And so at that time, barebacking obviously started to accelerate a lot more, and this meant that HIV transmission decreased. But unfortunately, what it also meant was that other STIs like gonorrhea and syphilis and chlamydia started to increase, and this is still a problem today within the chemsex scene. At the end of 2019, I spoke at the ICAD conference in Paris as the keynote speaker, and the topic that I spoke about was how the LGBT community had become more resilient, more empowered, and more aware because of the adversity they had experienced. And the three areas that I chose to speak about were the impact of minority stress, and also I spoke about chemsex, and I spoke about the AIDS crisis. And as I was preparing this presentation, what I noticed, which was quite interesting, is that the response by the LGBT community to the AIDS crisis had quite a few similarities to the way that the LGBT community is currently responding to the chemsex crisis. And I thought it would be quite interesting to just have a look at that now before we begin looking at HIV and chemsex in greater detail. So the first similarity I noticed was that one of the responses to the AIDS crisis was that the LGBT community developed supportive networks. And if you look at any documentary about that time, and it's very topical right now because of the death of Larry Kramer, who was an activist at the time, he started or became very involved with starting groups like ACT UP and the Gay Men's Health Crisis in the 80s, to protest to the government that we needed more funding and that the government needed to wake up and see that this was that AIDS was having a major impact on the LGBT community. And a lot of grassroots organisations began that were there to support the gay men who were dying from AIDS and to support their partners and to support their families. And, some of the organisations that were born out of that time were places like ACON in Sydney, the Also Foundation in Melbourne, and then in America you have the Gay Men's Health Centre in New York City. And you can see that these places developed en masse, around the world. You could probably find them in all the major gay hubs of the world. But what we're seeing today here as a response to the ChemSex phenomena is a lot of similar organisations that either existed as a response to the AIDS crisis or have developed now to respond to the ChemSex phenomena. And some examples of that are 5016 Street in London, which is these days very much tailored towards gay men's health, and especially they have therapists and healthcare workers that know quite a great deal about ChemSex. But you also have these organisations developing, such as Antidote in London, and another one called London Friend. You know, recently in Thailand, a LGBT rehab called R12 started, and within that program they developed CAP, which was the ChemSex Abstinence Project, which was specifically for chemsexes. And anywhere you look, anywhere in the world, you will find that any LGBT health organisation now is starting to respond to the chemsex phenomena by developing specific tracks and programs to help gay men. The second response to the AIDS crisis that occurred was that community events began, and they were developed in order to share experiences and for people to learn how to emotionally support each other. And so, you know, one example of that was the quilt project that started in the US. And, you know, each part of a quilt was designed by families and friends of a person who had died of AIDS. And eventually all these quilts that were dedicated to different people were sewn together, and this quilt ended up being held, started being presented at vigils and candlelight vigils, things like this, and then ultimately in pride marches around the world. So this too has started to occur a little bit with the chemsex phenomenon too, in that different programs are running within LGBT organisations. So for example, at the Melbourne Positive Living Centre in Australia, they started a program called Unwired, and this was where different LGBT people could come and work on their chemsex issues, but also support one another in their chemsex journey. And also another example of this is the International Forum, which began 3 years ago in London, the European Chemsex Forum, and then again in 2018 in Berlin and 2019 in Paris. And this development, or this forum, was created so that all the people involved with the health organisations at the front line dealing with chemsexes were able to share their ideas and their understanding, so that, for example, Mainline in Amsterdam, which is a harm reduction agency, and 5016 Street, as I spoke about earlier, and there's another one called the Gay Men's Health Alliance in Toronto. People could come together and share their experiences and their research and their findings to increase the way, or the effectivity of helping chemsexes who are struggling in various countries. The next reaction to the AIDS crisis that is of note is that we learn to overcome social ignorance and aggression in regard to the AIDS crisis, which we discovered was mostly driven by heterosexism and homophobia. And as I spoke about before, Larry Kramer was an activist at the time who really tried to shake up not only, you know, the heterosexual dominant paradigm at the time, but also gay men to come to understand how valuable and important they are. And I think one of the things that happens at the European Chemsex Forum each year is that different people from different organisations who are not necessarily LGBT but come into contact with chemsexes are invited to this conference. And at this conference this year, I sat next to a woman from Switzerland who was a doctor. She was a heterosexual, and she was at that conference because she wanted to have a better understanding of all the factors that affect gay men engaging in chemsex. And I thought this was a wonderful thing, because she said that she didn't necessarily choose to work with chemsex and chemsex clients. However, she found herself in an organisation where this was quite prevalent, and she wanted to educate herself and learn how to be of maximum assistance and effectiveness to helping these kind of men. And the way she did that was by attending this conference and learning how to actually be of assistance without being discriminatory, or to let her own judgments about gay men get in the way. So As I said, one of the responses to the AIDS crisis was that grassroots organisations started to protest and demand more funding for research into medication. And the parallel now with the ChemSex phenomena is that after the Berlin ChemSex conference, groups of people from different organisations around Europe started to put together a document to apply for more funding to go into chemsex research and into organisations that are dealing with chemsexes on a large scale. And this ultimately will benefit everyone, not only from the research, but from the support and the assistance we are giving to these kind of men. Another aspect that was important as a reaction to the AIDS crisis was that at that time, we faced stigma from a moralistic majority who believed that we deserved HIV and AIDS, and that in fact we may have even caused it by our own bad or immoral behaviour. And what we see now with the chemsex phenomenon is that one of the major reasons that gay men don't reach out for help is that they're afraid of the stigma for being judged for their sexual behaviour or their drug use behaviour. And so one of the really valuable things that has come out of the European Chemsex Forum is the education of all people who work in healthcare centres to really work on being non-judgmental, to apply an empathic approach and a position of unconditional positive regard, and also letting gay men know in each of these circumstances that it's not really helpful to beat yourself up for being in this position or to think of yourself as immoral, but that the actual engaging in the chemsex when it's at its most problematic is the way that a gay man is trying to seek belonging or a sense of identity, or, you know, trying to find pleasure or to connect with other people. And this is not a bad thing, but if it's causing harm to themselves or to other people, maybe there are other ways we can look at how they find that sense of self or that identity or that connection. As a response to the AIDS epidemic, we developed new ways of honouring queer lives. So what does that mean? You know, as I spoke about before with the Quilt Project, this was a way that the LGBT community found that they could pay respect to the gay men that had died of AIDS. And not only, you know, was it a personal thing, it was something that they wanted to do on a public scale, as I said before, at pride marches and candlelight vigils out in the open. And this allowed us to honour those queer lives. And I think that in terms of the chemsex phenomena, there are gay men who are dying from chemsex. And, you know, just to give an example, again, with Larry Kramer's recent death, a lot of the comments on Facebook ended with "rest in power." And I think this is a good example of how we're honouring gay lives, such as Larry Kramer, you know, rather than saying "rest in peace, rest in power," as a response and with respect to all the good he did by his protesting and demanding of respect for gay men. As a response to the HIV crisis back in the 80s, we learned so much about queer health, and we developed an infrastructure of delivery so that gay men could get all their needs attended to. And this took quite a bit of time. And what I love about what's happening now, since, for example, the chemsex phenomena is really only 10 years old in Europe and in the UK, is that, again, these organisations like 5016 Street, London Friend, Antidote, and, you know, a whole range of different organisations through Europe, they are all gathering their knowledge and they're sharing their knowledge, and they're doing all that they can to really support gay men to be the healthiest that they can be and to look after themselves and to understand and practice good self-care. Because this section is about HIV and chemsex, I think that when we look at David Foster's text, Lust, Men and Meth, he discusses in there that often the people that are most susceptible to getting involved with chemsex are men who have been HIV positive for at least 15 to 20 years. And the reasons that he gives for this is that often they will have less energy, their libidos might be lower, so they're using chemsex to be able to ignite that libido and have more sex. They sometimes can be more isolated if they're older, or if for some reason being HIV positive takes away their self-esteem or their confidence to go out and mingle with other people. And sometimes they're dealing with a lot more physical ailments, and they're using chemsex as a way to distract from or to not think about those problems. Sometimes too, people who've been HIV positive for 15 to 20 years can often feel older and more lonely, and to avoid really worrying about the fact that they're getting older on the gay scene or that they're feeling lonely, chemsex is the way they are choosing to connect with other men and to not have to worry or think about these issues. So the next thing to remember with HIV and chemsex is that PrEP is still available today. Whilst PrEP is still quite popular, PrEP is post-exposure prophylaxis. And this is if during chemsex someone has an incident where, let's say, they're HIV negative and they're afraid they might have been put at risk to HIV. If they take a 4-week course of HIV medication within 72 hours of that incident, it makes it very unlikely that they will contract HIV. Taking this medication in this way is most effective within 24 hours of the incident happening and loses its effectiveness after 72 hours. Also, one of the common features with chemsex is that often gay men will engage in sex for 2, 3, 4 or 5 days. And so if they actually have an incident during this time and they continue to take GHB and crystal meth and they lose track of time, then by the time they start to come down or remember that they've had an unsafe incident occur, by then it will be too late for them to take PrEP. So PrEP is pre-exposure prophylaxis, and this is the regular use of a medication to prevent HIV, which is highly effective. Usually it's a pill taken once a day at the same time. And if you are HIV negative and taking this pill consistently, then there should be no risk of contracting HIV. So this medication really came into play around 2016, and up until that point, there had been trials, gay men were put on trials, and then, towards the end of 2016 in most Western countries, it became available on a larger scale. And that's, as I said before, when we saw the rates of HIV dropping. One thing that I think is interesting to be aware of is that there are some people in the non-HIV communities and healthcare centres who know nothing about PrEP and are usually quite shocked when you explain it to them, and they say they never knew that this existed. And there can also, in fact, be some stigma towards the idea of gay men using PrEP. And an example of this is the performer Azealia Banks, who had a bit of a rant on her Instagram page a few years back when she heard about PrEP, and she basically said, great, gay men who are already promiscuous are going to go out and continue to be promiscuous and have sex with lots of people and get more STIs. And so you can see how different people will look at PrEP in different ways, because there's also a way of looking at PrEP as that this is a way for gay men to take full responsibility for their sex lives. Gay men have often been creative and been adventurous in the way that they have sex, and by being responsible in taking PrEP consistently, they're able to slow down and actually reduce the amount of HIV transmission that occurs. Treatment as prevention is the regular use of antiretroviral medication to prevent HIV infection to others. Regular and consistent use of these medication means that a person's immune system is not compromised. They are kept well and healthy. And studies have shown that if a person has undetectable viral load, then there is zero risk of HIV transmission to another person. So how is this relevant to chemsex? So often with chemsex, a person can sort of go into a chemsex vortex, not surfacing for days and days, going from, one sex experience to a different sex experience, and taking quite a few drugs as well. And so one of the problems is that they forget to take their HIV medication consistently, and this can sometimes cause a risk of their viral load increasing making them possibly more likely to transmit HIV to another person. Despite PrEP being quite accessible today in most Western countries for gay men, quite a lot of gay men are still using condoms and water-based lube as a way of not transmitting HIV and also protecting themselves from HIV. So in this case, it is best if the lubricants that they're using are water-based or silicone-based so that the strength of the condom is not compromised. Oil-based lube will often erode the condom. And with ChemSex, most gay men don't want to wear condoms these days, especially with PrEP and with PEP available. So this often will increase the chances that HIV can be spread, and definitely with STIs as well. And one of the problems for gay men who are sex workers today is that they are continually bombarded by clients saying that they want to have BB or they want raw, and if they don't, they'll go to a different escort. So this puts a lot of pressure on sex workers to not use condoms or use lube. So these are all factors that need to be taken into consideration when you're dealing with a gay man in a healthcare centre in regard to HIV transmission. In regard to injecting, mixing water is also a really important factor. And so if gay men are using in an environment where they've been using for days and days and they don't have any sterile water, obviously there's going to be a greater risk of infection. So it's always important to have sterile water available. Boiled water and non-carbonated water can be used as well. And it's also important never to draw from a water source with a used syringe. Tourniquets are the equipment that are used to wrap around the upper arm so that a vein will become more prominent, preparing a site for injection. It's always helpful if you have your own tourniquet, because often droplets of blood can fall on them, which makes them a hepatitis C risk. And also, it's also important, if you can possibly, to use a new one each hit. And often needle and syringe programs will have disposable ones available. Often during ChemSex, gay men will use needles if they're injecting, and they'll be using tourniquets as well. So sharing equipment means there is a greater risk of HIV and viral hepatitis spread. So to prevent HIV in these cases, always use new syringes. Filters that are used once should not be reused, and also spoons must be disinfected after each use. It's also quite helpful to always have fresh alcohol swabs available at any time. Sometimes when gay men have been partying for a few days and using drugs, they run out of condoms and they don't feel like they can leave the apartment to get new condoms. They might resort to the pulling out technique to reduce HIV transmission. I would say it's not a very successful method of HIV prevention, but it will reduce the chance of it. So pulling out involves removing the penis before ejaculating during anal sex. But one of the problems with this is that the HIV virus can stay alive within pre-cum. So using pulling out also runs the risk of not pulling out in time, and in the heat of the moment when two people are high on drugs, it's going to be very difficult to remember to pull out and not come inside another person. So sero-sorting is the next aspect of ChemSex and HIV that I want to talk about. This is sex between people who choose sexual partners who share the same HIV status as themselves. So obviously this is going to be very helpful when you have two people that are HIV positive who are engaging in ChemSex together. But where this becomes problematic is when one person thinks they're HIV negative and they're with another partner who says they're HIV negative, and a person hasn't had a test for a period of time, or they've recently been infected, and they share with the other person, disclose with them that they're HIV negative when in fact they're positive. And especially if they've obviously recently seroconverted, their viral load will be quite high. So, this is also a very risky way of trying to reduce HIV transmission. Strategic position is when two men not using condoms or PrEP or treatment as prevention sexually positioning themselves to reduce the risk of passing on HIV. So an example of this is a man who is HIV negative, who's playing with an HIV positive partner, and they take the top or dominant role. So this, in their minds, will reduce the possibility of HIV transmission. But again, while it does reduce the risk of transmission, it is not the most effective approach. So today, I've tried to give you a full overview of all the different ways that gay men can take care of each other when they're engaging in chemsex to prevent HIV transmission. Some of these ways are obviously more effective than others, and usually these days, a lot of gay men, especially in Western countries, will be using treatment as prevention or PrEP to stop HIV transmission.